What's going on, everyone? If you love the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you're definitely in the right place. Today's story is one of those rare cases that gets more intense with every passing moment, and by the end, you'll be glad you stuck around. Before we dive in, if you enjoy this story, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for more. Also, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now in your part of the world. All right, let's get started. The stories. What a delivery driver saw outside the last house on the route. The incident reportedly came from a route sheet pulled from an old regional dispatch office, and it referenced a final stop that never made sense. The archived note mentioned a driver who claimed someone waited outside the last house even after the street was cleared. Rylan Mercer was 32 and worked as a delivery driver for a regional shipping line that handled late evening drop-offs. He lived in a small rented place near a quiet highway spur and tried to keep his nights predictable. He clocked in around sunset and followed the route grid until everything on the manifest was scanned. He liked that rhythm and needed the extra hours after rising fuel prices drained his budget. The night that changed him came in early autumn of 2019 when a mild drizzle pushed across the county roads. His simple goal was to clear the last 4 stops before 9 so he could get home. The final house sat at the far edge of a sparsely built neighborhood where new construction had stalled after funding issues slowed development. Rylan reached the second-to-last stop without trouble and scanned the small parcel while a porch light flickered behind the occupant. He waved, returned to his truck, and checked the tablet. The final address displayed a short note that read, "Gate partially damaged. Approach with caution." He thought it sounded dramatic, but he kept moving because delays meant more paperwork. The dirt road to the final house felt different because the gravel ruts were deeper than they looked on satellite maps. His tires shook through the uneven track, and he slowed so the cargo would not shift. He remembered the drizzle turning into a steady fall that made the old fence lines appear faded. His truck headlights cut across the trees while the route timer beeped. The house came into view as a single-story structure with siding worn by years of heat. An old pickup sat beside the carport with its door cracked open like someone left in a hurry. Rylan stepped out, grabbed the padded envelope, and noticed a figure standing near the tree line. The person faced the house and barely moved. Rylan called out because it seemed natural. The figure did not answer. He felt uneasy, but walked toward the porch because the package needed a signature. He knocked on the weathered door and waited until a woman in her 40s answered with tired eyes that hinted at several sleepless nights. Her name was listed as Marquez, and she signed without looking away from the tree line. She whispered that someone had been standing there for 3 nights. Rylan glanced back toward the trees and saw the figure slowly turn, as if reacting to the porch light. He asked Mara if she knew who it was. She said no and explained that local deputies had driven by earlier but found no footprints. She added that her dog refused to go outside after dusk. Rylan tried to reassure her, but he felt tense when the figure stepped closer. He returned to his truck and logged the delivery while watching the silhouette move with an unusual stiffness. He noted that the figure wore a long coat that flapped in the wind, yet the shape underneath did not shift. He heard a soft tapping on his side mirror and thought it was a branch until he noticed no branches reached that far. He started the engine and pulled slightly forward. Mara called out from the porch, asking him not to leave yet because she feared the figure might approach her door again. Rylan kept the truck idling and stepped out with his phone raised. The figure paused near the edge of the driveway and tilted its head as if listening. Rylan recorded a short, shaky video for possible evidence and captured the moment the figure retreated into the dark corner of the lot. He urged Mara to call the non-emergency line again. She did and mentioned his presence in the background. Dispatch reportedly confirmed previous calls from that address during the same week. Rylan waited until she hung up, then walked toward the driveway entrance to check for tracks. The drizzle had softened the soil, but he noticed 2 long impressions in the mud that did not match any standard boot pattern. He crouched to inspect the impressions and realized they looked stretched, as if the heel marks dragged unnaturally. He took photos to document it because the deputies would need something clear in case the rain erased the evidence. When he stood, he saw movement near the abandoned construction lot behind the house and raised his phone again. The figure reappeared near an unfinished foundation block. Rylan shouted, asking what they wanted, and the figure responded with a faint rattling sound that could have been fabric or gear. It stepped behind the block and vanished from sight. Rylan reached the spot within seconds, but found nothing except a plastic tape marker used by survey crews. He picked it up and noticed someone had written a date that predated the stalled project by 2 years. Mara approached carefully and said previous owners told her strange things about that construction lot. She reported hearing scraping sounds at night and seeing floodlights flicker without power issues. Rylan suggested checking the old project files because developers usually left public records. Mara said she tried, but half the records were archived manually before digital conversion. Rylan offered to look at the files later because he had experience sorting scanned documents from a part-time job years earlier. She thanked him and pointed to the tree line again. The figure stood there once more, closer than before, and seemed to watch them without any visible breathing motion. Rylan backed away and urged Mara to go inside. He waited in his truck until deputies arrived. They swept the area with flashlights and found nothing except the strange impressions in the mud. One deputy mentioned similar calls from another street where witnesses described a silent watcher near multiple houses. He said the figure always retreated beyond the last visible yard before vanishing in the dark. Rylan drove home late and reviewed his video. He noticed a faint reflection on the figure's coat that resembled a badge clip or small tool. He zoomed in and saw a blurred shape that matched old utility company tags from the early 2000 era. Employees sometimes wore heavy coats during winter maintenance, and older coats used reflective threading around the collar. The next day, he visited a small records desk at the county office. He asked about utility work in the stalled development. A clerk pulled a faded binder that listed crew rotations from 2001 to 2003. One name had several warnings about night shifts, where the worker logged extended hours without partner verification. A final note mentioned an unresolved disappearance during a routine inspection after a severe storm. Rylan compared the coat description from the old files to the figure in his video. The match seemed close, but not perfect. He requested access to old lot surveys and found a handwritten report describing a flagged hazard trench near the exact foundation block where the figure vanished. The report stated the trench was filled without proper inspection because storms destroyed monitoring equipment. He returned to Mara later that week and showed her the findings. She said deputies had returned twice and installed a temporary sensor light. She had not seen the figure since the previous night, but her dog still refused to approach the tree line. Rylan and Mara walked to the construction lot and checked the ground. The soil had settled unevenly, suggesting a collapse zone beneath the surface. Rylan believed the figure might be a residual impression or a person reenacting old patterns from a job that ended abruptly. He shared the theory with Mara, and she nodded, relieved to hear something grounded rather than supernatural. They both agreed the coat and the strange movements could indicate someone reenacting a memory or suffering confusion while hiding from help. The county eventually fenced the lot after a safety inspector confirmed unstable ground. Rylan moved to a different route by winter and rarely saw the neighborhood again. He kept the video and photos in a private folder and updated dispatch about the gate note so new drivers would avoid the unstable area. He thought about the figure sometimes when rain hit the windshield during his late runs. The memory stayed sharp because the silence in that yard felt heavier than the weather. He never claimed to know the full truth, but he trusted the possibility of a confused worker returning to a familiar site. He understood that some routes go beyond simple deliveries. He believed the last house had carried a story that lingered longer than any scanned package. The nurse who refused to enter room 6 again. Lila Farnes first heard about room 6 through a short entry in an old staffing report that mentioned unusual overnight disruptions. The report was dated to 2009 and came from a small regional clinic that sat outside a quiet town with limited medical resources. Lila was 33 and worked as a traveling nurse who filled short contracts in understaffed facilities. She arrived at the clinic during early autumn when the halls felt calm and the night shift moved slowly through predictable routines. Her simple goal that week was to keep a steady rhythm while saving money for a move planned for the next spring. On her second night, she was assigned a rotation that included room 6, which held a recovering patient named Dorian Pike. He was 62 with a mild respiratory issue that required observation but posed no immediate danger. His chart suggested stable progress, which meant the room should have been an easy stop during her quiet rounds. The incident began when Lila stepped inside the room and noticed a faint tapping sound that seemed to come from the wall near the bed. The patient had been awake, and he watched her with an uneasy expression that suggested he wanted to speak, but hesitated. She asked if he needed anything, and he answered with a flat, "Please keep the lights on tonight," which struck her as odd, given his preference for darkness noted earlier by the day nurse. During her next pass, the tapping returned and felt sharper, like something struck the wall with steady intent. Lila checked the hallway and found nothing unusual beyond a supply cart resting near a closed door. She reviewed maintenance notes later and saw that workers had previously inspected the wall after a similar complaint in 2006, yet found no loose utilities or structural issues. The complication deepened when a nurse on the shift before hers mentioned archived calls made by former night staff. Those calls reportedly described patient distress related to sudden cold drafts that moved through room 6 even when vents were shut. Lila filed this in her mind, but kept her focus on what she could directly verify, which meant returning to the room with a calm approach and simple checks. When she entered again, she saw Dorian clutching the call button with both hands and staring at the same wall that had produced the tapping. He whispered, "They move through here," which confused her because he had no history of disorientation and his oxygen levels looked normal. She tried reassuring him, but he pointed toward a small framed print that hung crooked like someone had pushed it earlier. Lila documented the scene, then stepped into the hallway to compare notes with the evening charge nurse named Brenton Shaw. He was in his late 40s and had worked the clinic for many years, which gave him perspective on long-standing issues. Brenton admitted that room 6 had frequent incident logs related to unexplained noise, but he never saw anything dangerous, so he kept assignments unchanged. The investigation began after Dorian reported that someone had touched his arm during a period when no staff had entered the room. Lila checked the security panel near the nurse's station, which showed timestamps for door openings captured by the badge sensor. The logs indicated her previous visit, followed by a long gap with no recorded entry, which made his claim puzzling. She then reviewed older patient notes from 2003 to 2008, which described brief episodes of agitation from individuals with no history of anxiety. Several mentioned hearing movement behind the wall near the bed, and one wrote that a picture frame had tilted during a quiet stretch. These details were small but consistent, which encouraged her to look for a physical explanation. Lila asked the maintenance lead named Corbin Rusk to inspect the wall after her shift ended. He brought a handheld thermal scanner and ran it across the surface while she watched from the doorway. The tool showed a thin vertical band of cooler temperature that did not match the building layout, which suggested an unregistered cavity or narrow chase behind the drywall. Corbin returned during daylight with a small borescope camera designed to look behind tight spaces. He located a hidden seam in the corner that had been painted over during earlier renovations. When he guided the camera inside, they saw a slender gap between structural supports where unsecured pipes ran without proper insulation, which explained both the cold drafts and the intermittent tapping. The twist emerged when Corbin followed the pipes farther and discovered that the cavity connected to an abandoned service chase sealed decades earlier, according to archived renovation notes. That chase once linked several rooms, including room 6, where older patients had repeatedly complained about footsteps at night. The noise likely traveled along the hollow space and grew sharper as the building shifted during temperature changes. Lila returned to Dorian with the findings, which eased his fear because it gave something concrete to replace earlier uncertainty. She watched him relax when she explained how air moved through the gap and how small vibrations struck the wall during normal settling. He nodded and said, "That makes more sense than what I thought," which helped restore predictable routines for the rest of his stay. The payoff became clear a few days later when the clinic sealed the gap with proper insulation, which stopped the tapping that had bothered so many night staff over the years. Lila felt relieved because the solution fit every clue she had gathered from logs, witness comments, and earlier maintenance records. She no longer feared the room and worked her shifts without hesitation. Still, she remembered the moment she first stepped into room 6 and sensed tension that felt older than her short assignment. She knew many stories deepen when fearful people misread unfamiliar sounds, but she also understood how convincing those moments can feel. Later, she often said that small mysteries usually shrink under steady checking and clear evidence, which matched her experience at the clinic. Lila finished her contract without further issues and moved to her next job carrying a quiet confidence shaped by those nights. She still thought about Dorian and the relief in his voice after learning the real cause behind the unsettling moments. Room 6 stayed sealed and silent after the repairs, which meant future patients would sleep without wondering what moved behind the wall. The stories. The mine shaft everyone avoids after one winter shift. Hushed stories about a troubled winter shift lingered around an old mining town where people rarely challenged its harsh land. Locals claimed the trouble began after a night when a minor accident exposed something deeper than ice inside an abandoned shaft. Ryder Halden was 34 and worked as a maintenance tech for a small mining contractor that handled seasonal repairs. He arrived in the area during early winter to inspect older ventilation lines after a storm damaged several service roads. He hoped to finish his tasks fast because he planned to drive south before deeper snow arrived. His simple goal was to check the inactive shaft called Northcut and file a routine report that usually required little effort. The incident started when Ryder reached the frozen service trail and noticed fresh tire marks that did not match company vehicles. He studied the tracks because they curved sharply near the locked entrance, and he felt annoyed since trespassing caused delays. He followed the marks for a short distance and found the company padlock on the gate sitting open in the snow. That immediately changed his plan because an unlocked gate meant he needed to walk inside and confirm that no one had entered recently. The complication grew once he stepped into the dim first chamber and heard a steady tapping sound echoing from deeper tunnels. Ryder paused because the mine had been inactive for more than 10 years, according to archived maintenance logs stored in the base office. He tried to convince himself that melting ice caused the noise, yet the tapping kept a slow rhythm that felt intentional. Nearby walls held old chalk markings that matched diagrams found in earlier reports, though he spotted one new line that seemed recently drawn. He documented the finding with his work phone because unusual markings required clear evidence for supervisors. The photo captured a faint boot print beside the chalk line, and that raised his concern further. Ryder checked the archived inspection sheets stored on the local server earlier that morning, and none mentioned any recent site visits other than his. He decided to walk deeper because standard protocol ordered a full sweep whenever unauthorized signs appeared. He carried a small lantern since the wired lights no longer functioned after their power source was removed several years prior. During his investigation, he followed the tapping while keeping his pace slow, and he noticed the pattern shift whenever he stopped moving. Ryder wondered if frozen beams strained under winter pressure, yet the sound seemed too controlled to match structural stress. The tunnel floor held dusty rail tracks once used for small carts, and he saw scattered debris that did not appear in previous photos taken during a 2018 inspection. Among the pieces, he noticed a bent metal badge with faded lettering that seemed older than the shutdown date. He recorded its location because older equipment sometimes surfaced during thaw periods, and supervisors liked accurate notes. The tapping finally ceased near a narrow drop that led to a secondary shaft called split turn, according to age diagrams. Ryder checked archived calls from the company emergency line on his tablet because the area once hosted minor cave-ins, and he found one brief report from 2009 that mentioned a missing day laborer whose case ended without clear closure. The record did not list a name, and Ryder assumed it was a typical incomplete file from seasonal hiring cycles. Still, the timing of the tapping felt too strange and forced him to rethink his assumptions about the site. He crouched near the drop and shined his lantern downward, where he spotted a small fabric scrap wedged between two beams. The scrap looked newer than the surrounding decay, and he recognized the color because it matched safety jackets issued during recent winter shifts at the company depot. Ryder felt uneasy because no crew members reported missing gear that month, and the depot logs showed no issued jackets beyond standard signouts. He reached for the scrap carefully and noticed dried dirt on its underside, along with faint char marks that resembled contact with a heated surface. As he studied the scrap, a distant metallic clang echoed from behind him, which made him turn quickly. Ryder called out for any possible trespasser, and his voice bounced through the tunnels without a reply. He replayed earlier photos on his phone to compare debris positions, and he realized a thin wooden plank on the floor behind him now leaned at a sharper angle. He felt certain he did not touch it earlier, so he took another photo, planning to discuss it with security because possible movement indicated human presence or shifting beams. Ryder climbed out of the narrow section and moved toward the first chamber, using the lantern to check each corner. On the way, he discovered a shallow scrape on the wall that looked freshly made, and the chalky dust sat loose on the ground below it. He checked his steps carefully because he wanted to avoid contaminating the scene before proper documentation. He snapped a photo and noted its timestamp for supervisors, who required clear tracking of each entry detail. As he reached the first chamber, the cold air felt sharper, and carried a faint burnt scent that had not been present earlier. Ryder scanned the floor for heat sources but found only patches of frost that melted near the gate. He felt confused because the temperature should have dropped consistently inside an inactive shaft during winter storms. His attention returned to the open padlock because fresh scarring around its hinge suggested someone forced it quickly rather than using a key. He stepped outside and followed the tire tracks up the service trail. The sun hung low and gave the snow an orange tint that made details easier to spot. Ryder found a second set of prints beside the tire marks, which looked like boots with shallow tread, and the stride pattern suggested a slow walk. He recorded this because incidents involving unauthorized visitors required complete documentation for liability protection. The prints led toward a bend where the snow deepened around an old equipment shed with a cracked metal roof. At the shed, he found the door slightly ajar and signs of recent activity like disturbed dust and dragged footprints. Ryder pushed the door open and found a large portable heater tipped on its side with a melted patch around its vent. The heater model matched units removed from service years earlier due to overheating risks, and he knew they remained stored at a warehouse miles away. Ryder checked the shed floor and found more scraps of the same jacket material he collected earlier, which suggested a link to the heater incident. Tapping returned faintly from the direction of the mine, which forced him to choose between returning to safety or completing his sweep. He paused because protocol permitted retreat when structural risks arose, yet he believed the evidence required a clearer connection. Ryder replayed the metallic clang in his mind and concluded that the noise did not match natural stress shifts. He walked back toward the gate with steady steps while comparing earlier tire tracks to ensure no new marks appeared during his absence. Inside the chamber again, Ryder traced the tapping to a side tunnel sealed during the 2009 incident mentioned in archived calls. The seal consisted of old boards nailed across the tunnel mouth, yet one board sagged as if recently disturbed. He lifted his lantern and saw soot on the edges that resembled the heater melt pattern from the shed. Ryder removed gloves and checked the temperature of the soot but found it cold, which meant the disturbance happened earlier. Behind the boards, he noticed another chalk mark shaped like a short horizontal line above a circle. He tried to recall earlier diagrams and realized this symbol appeared in a forgotten annex report describing temporary holding zones used for equipment staging. Ryder removed a loose board and peered into the dark opening where he saw a narrow pit with metal fragments scattered along its base. Among them, he saw a torn patch of the same jacket color that seemed older with deeper dirt embedded in its fibers. He lowered his lantern deeper and noticed something else. A structural support beam bore a fresh dent shaped like the corner of a heater casing. He understood then that someone tried to use older gear to heat part of the tunnel, possibly to locate or free something buried under the pit. This linked the heater scrap, soot marks, and scorch on the jacket pieces into a single sequence, suggesting a recent search attempt. Ryder backed away because he realized the person or people involved might still be nearby. Before leaving, he noticed his lantern flicker and then regain strength. The tapping stopped again, which heightened his urgency. Ryder stepped out into the open trail and felt the frozen wind strike harder as he reached his truck. He contacted dispatch and requested a site lockdown due to signs of unauthorized entry and possible hazardous activity. Dispatch promised to send a team after sunrise, since travel remained dangerous during heavy winter. A follow-up investigation reportedly found additional heater fragments inside the shed, along with prints that matched no employees. Witness statements from nearby residents mentioned a person seen in a bright jacket entering the service trail 2 nights earlier. No one confirmed the identity, and footage from an old roadside camera offered only a blurred outline walking toward the gate. The pit area remained sealed after teams scanned it with ground sensors that detected minor voids but no confirmed remains or trapped equipment. Ryder later reviewed his photos and noted that the chalk symbol above the circle matched older maps that marked forgotten test zones unrelated to recorded accidents. Supervisors concluded that someone might have misinterpreted the old reports and attempted an unapproved search inside the shaft. They reinforced the gate and added warning signs that urged people to avoid the trail during winter shifts. To this day, the mine shaft remains closed, and locals still talk about the tapping that drifted through it that season. Ryder kept his notes stored on his tablet because he believed the sounds came from shifting beams rather than any hidden person. Yet he understood why others felt uneasy when passing that trail, especially when winter storms made the land crack and echo in unpredictable ways. The stories. What a hunter's dash cam, caught before it went dark. Ranger files reportedly include a brief dashcam clip from a small county trail where a hunter vanished during a quiet winter morning. The footage circulated among local deputies for years, and some said it captured the last clear moment before everything went dark. Calder Rusk was a 39-year-old warehouse supervisor who hunted whitetail on weekends near an old service road outside a rural township. He liked the quiet routine because it reminded him of calm trips he took with his uncle during the late 1990s. On a cold morning in early 2017, he set out before sunrise with a simple goal to test a new trail camera he had mounted near a frozen creek. He drove a faded pickup with a budget dashcam that ran whenever the engine turned, and he kept it for insurance reasons. He headed toward the tree line under a pale sky and planned to reach his blind before other hunters scattered the deer. He parked near a thin cluster of spruce trees and noted the strange sound of distant engines that did not match the usual logging trucks. He stepped out, locked the truck, then grabbed a small pack that held water and a thermal layer. While crossing the first ridge, he heard a sharp crack from the lower creek bed that stopped him long enough to check for falling branches. He saw nothing moving through the frost and continued toward his blind with the plan to return by mid-afternoon. The trigger came when he noticed a line of prints that curved away from the creek with a stride that seemed too wide for any deer. He crouched and studied the marks, which looked oddly pressed, as if a heavy object had settled briefly before sliding forward. Witness statements from two hikers later confirmed a loud metallic scrape in that area around dawn. Calder followed the prints along a narrow stretch where the snow had thinned near a power cut. He took out his phone and snapped 3 photos, which appeared in the recovered data after his disappearance. In the first photo, his gloved hand pointed at a deep trough in the ice. In the second photo, a faint reflection hinted at a dull shape beneath the surface. In the third photo, the trail bent toward a thicket with sharp broken branches. Complications piled up when he reached the old blind and found the canvas flap torn along the side where he kept a small heater. He checked his gear, muttered that kids might have messed with it, then noticed the same strange prints circling the blind at least twice. A nearby birch trunk had a fresh gouge that lined with a rough metal edge rather than any animal claw. He reportedly radioed a friend named Orrin Dale around mid-morning and mentioned a set of tracks that looked artificial. Orrin later told deputies that Calder sounded tired but focused, which matched the timestamp on the dashcam file. The truck sat untouched all morning except for a brief moment when the wind pushed snow across the lens. Calder decided to hike toward the ridge above the old service road since the prints kept drifting uphill. While climbing, he spotted a rusted trail marker that had not been maintained since 2005, and he stopped long enough to compare the lower section with the strange gouge on his blind. The cuts matched in width and depth, which led him to believe someone had been dragging old equipment through the property. He continued over the ridge and entered a narrow pass where discarded fencing lay half-buried under ice. He bent to check a twisted strand and noticed faint smudges that looked like dried hydraulic fluid. The smell was faint but distinct, which suggested a leaking machine had passed through at some point during the previous night. He recorded a short voice note on his phone, saying he planned to follow the trail until noon. Deputies later found that note in the recovered cloud folder, which helped build a basic timeline. According to weather logs, the wind picked up around midday and the ridge became unstable. Forest crews said a section of the old pass sometimes shifted during heavy gusts, which caused minor slides that could trap a person in loose snow. Yet something in the final dashcam clip suggested a different angle. By early afternoon, Calder returned to his truck, but he looked unsettled. The dashcam captured him walking from the tree line with quick, heavy steps while glancing over his shoulder. He opened the door, tossed his pack onto the passenger seat, then leaned inside while breathing hard. A faint metallic clatter echoed from the ridge, which made him freeze for 5 full seconds. He whispered, "That was not a deer," then climbed in and started the engine. The camera angle showed his eyes tracking something moving between the trees. Snow drifted across the hood while a light creak came from behind the truck. The sound repeated twice with a rising pitch that made him tense his shoulders before shifting into reverse. He backed a few feet, paused, then pulled forward, as if unsure which direction offered safety. His hands shook on the wheel and he muttered, "Come on," while trying to scan the tree line. The camera struggled to focus because frost built on the windshield, yet a brief silhouette appeared to the right. The shape seemed tall, with a narrow top that tapered toward the ground. Officials never confirmed that detail, though. Several deputies mentioned the silhouette in informal notes preserved in the archived case file. The shape moved once, then vanished when the camera auto-adjusted. Calder shifted again and chose the narrow path back toward the main road. His breathing slowed, but he kept glancing at the rear mirror as if tracking invisible movement. 20 seconds before the file ended, the truck lurched violently to the left, which knocked the camera sideways. A burst of static filled the audio, and a heavy thud landed somewhere near the rear bumper. Calder shouted, "Hey, stop!" Then the camera caught a slanted view of the ridge, where a dark form slid under the branches. Snow showered the hood as he pressed the accelerator in panic. The final clear frame showed a long scrape running across the truck bed, which matched the gouge found on his blind. Investigators believed something metallic struck the truck during that moment, although no working equipment was ever logged on that road. The clip ended when the camera lost power due to a damaged cable that had been cleanly severed. Calder Rusk was reported missing the next morning when he failed to show for a shift at the warehouse. Search teams found his truck stuck in a shallow drift about a mile from the service road. Tracks around the vehicle were distorted by wind, though one responder noted a long impression shaped like a flattened cylinder that matched the strange prints seen near the creek. Despite a wide search, no clear evidence explained what he chased or what followed him down the ridge that day. Rangers later concluded that unstable terrain and poor visibility likely contributed to his disappearance. They preserved the dashcam clip because the strange sounds and the silhouette raised questions they could not fully answer. Years later, locals still talk about the footage that flickered for a few seconds before going dark. Some point to old reports of scrap equipment dumped along the ridge, while others mention odd engine noises heard during cold mornings. Whatever happened that day seemed tied to the silent shape moving through the trees as Calder rushed back to his truck. The story now serves as a quiet warning for anyone who hikes beyond that old service road. People say the trail feels different after heavy snow, and the ridges shift without warning. The clip remains the only known record of what a single hunter found before everything faded into static and winter silence. The stories. This park bench became the key to 5 disappearances. In many archived reports tied to a quiet suburban trail, one park bench kept showing up in every witness statement. The bench sat beside an older walking path that locals used for years, and it became the center of a strange pattern tied to 5 missing people. The story followed a 34-year-old technician named Braden Lyle, who lived a few miles from the park. He worked maintenance shifts at a small distribution center, and he often stopped by the trail after long nights on the floor. He used the spot to unwind and clear his head before heading home. His goal that morning in early autumn of 2021 was simple. He planned to sit for a few minutes and send a short message to his sister who had been asking about a ride the following weekend. Braden parked near the first turnoff, and he walked toward the bench while thinking about breakfast. The path was empty that morning, and the air felt colder than it usually did. He reached the bench, and he set his bag down while noticing fresh flowers near the base. He had seen flowers there before, but usually only 1 or 2. That morning, he counted 3 bunches, and each looked recently placed. He sat and opened his phone, and that was when he heard a faint snap behind him. He turned, but saw no one on the path. He listened for a moment, and he heard what sounded like quiet breathing near the small cluster of trees. He stood and called out a simple greeting, and he waited without moving. The breathing faded, and he felt uneasy enough to step back from the bench. A woman approached from the trail side and asked if he had heard something by the trees. Her name was Maren Ulrich, a 31-year-old caseworker who visited the trail on her days off. She pointed toward the bench and said she had seen a man sitting there 2 days earlier who vanished after dropping a small notebook. Braden asked what she meant by vanished. She explained that the man had walked toward the trees, and no one saw him leave the area based on her follow-up checks. Braden felt a chill and picked up his bag, and he asked if she had looked around for the notebook. She nodded and said she had found it under the bench. She kept it at home after failing to find a name inside. She told him she could bring it later if he wanted to see it, and he agreed since the story bothered him. She said she would return in an hour after finishing her walk. Braden stayed near the bench and looked around the clearing while replaying her account. The flowers suddenly felt more significant, and he remembered a local post from late 2020 that mentioned a missing runner who often paused near that same bench. He opened an archived article on his phone and saw a blurred photo of the bench with a date stamp. His stomach tightened when he noticed the same pattern of flowers near the legs. He walked closer to the tree line and saw a strip of cloth caught on a branch. He reached up and pulled it free, and he noticed faint mud streaks along the fabric. He placed it on the bench and took a photo for his own record. He had done informal volunteer searches before, and he knew documenting small clues mattered when nothing else made sense. A man in his late 50s entered the clearing and stopped near the bench. He introduced himself as Arvin Drexler, a retired surveyor who lived across the road from the trail. He asked if Braden was looking into the disappearances tied to the area. Braden said he was only trying to understand what happened near the bench. Arvin nodded and said he had seen similar details across several years, and each case started with someone stopping to rest. Arvin pointed to a narrow gap in the trees where old markers hung from metal hooks. He said the markers were part of an abandoned drainage project from the early 2010s. He explained that the project left several deep maintenance pits that were never fully filled, and he believed people may have fallen into an access point hidden under thick brush. Braden asked if he ever reported that theory. Arvin said he tried, but no one followed up due to limited staff and unclear evidence. Marin returned with the notebook in her hand, and she gave it to Braden. The cover felt worn, and several pages had faint impressions of older notes. He flipped through and found a short line written on the last page. It said, "Met them again by the bench after nightfall." The handwriting looked shaky, and the ink appeared fresh compared to the other pages. Braden asked where exactly she found it. She said it had been wedged between two boards under the far side of the bench. Arvin leaned closer and said he had never seen anyone place a notebook there, which made him think the writer returned recently. Braden felt the temperature shift and noticed a faint draft coming from the gap in the trees. He walked toward the marked area and pushed aside thick branches. Beneath the fallen brush, he found a concrete lip with rusted bolts. The ground dipped sharply, and a hollow space opened several feet below. He knelt and used his phone light to check for movement. He saw only old tools and a broken ladder, yet something about the depth made his pulse race. He called out to ask if anyone was down there. No one answered, but a weak echo carried the sound back. Marin suggested checking the other side of the pit for a safer angle. They circled the clearing, and Arvin pointed to a collapsed section of fencing that partially covered another opening. Braden cleared some branches, and he spotted a shoe near the edge. The rubber looked worn, and the sole pattern matched a detail from the runner case he had read earlier. He carefully reached for it, and he noticed dry mud around the heel. Braden asked Arvin to hold his phone while he photographed the shoe. Marin stepped back to avoid disturbing the area, and she scanned the surrounding branches for more fabric. She pointed to another strip caught on a higher limb, which matched the cloth Braden found earlier. They connected the pieces and realized someone had likely moved through the gap with enough force to tear clothing. Braden called a non-emergency line and reported the discovery. He gave general details without naming the notebook and said he believed an old maintenance pit posed danger to visitors. A dispatcher said someone would check the site later, though no estimate was given. That answer frustrated Braden, and he decided to take additional photos to support the claim. As he prepared to leave, he noticed the flowers again and realized each bunch marked dates close to older missing person reports. He photographed the flowers and compared their spacing to the article images. The match felt close enough to suggest someone used the bench as a memorial or a signal. Marin suggested the writer of the notebook might have met someone connected to those flowers, and the line about meeting them again could imply repeated encounters. Braden opened the notebook once more and touched the last page. He noticed tiny indent marks above the line that hinted at a torn message. He angled the page toward the light and saw faint shapes. It looked like someone had written a location reference before removing the sheet. He took a close photo, planning to use editing tools later to enhance the impressions. They decided to walk the perimeter of the clearing before leaving, and Arvin guided them to an older fire road behind the benches. The road had cracked pavement and faded tape lines. He said he once saw a person wearing a reflective vest walking that area at night during 2018. He never identified the person, but he remembered the pattern on the vest matched old county uniforms that were discontinued years earlier. Braden connected that detail to the notebook entry and wondered if the writer had followed someone who claimed to inspect the trail. Marin said the county stopped sending inspectors to that area due to limited funding, which made the sighting even stranger. Arvin agreed and said the person may have used an old uniform to avoid suspicion. They returned to the bench, and Braden looked at the wooden boards where the notebook had been found. He noticed scrape marks near the underside. He slid a hand under the frame and found a small metal clip. It felt loose, and he pulled gently. A folded paper slipped out and landed on the ground. He unfolded it and read a short handwritten note that said, "Follow the lights near the cutoff after dark." The writing matched the notebook. Marin covered her mouth and said the message made her think someone used small lights to guide visitors toward the maintenance pit. Arvin said he once saw flickering lights near the cutoff during late 2019, but assumed they were kids playing with flashlights. Braden realized the lights may have lured curious people toward the gap. They stood silently as the idea settled. The disappearances could have been accidents caused by a hidden pit and a misleading light source. The writer of the notebook may have followed the lights and nearly fell or witnessed someone else fall. Braden suggested the writer tore out the earlier page to give it to someone, possibly a friend or an officer, yet the person never turned it in. A faint gust moved through the clearing, and Braden felt uneasy again. He gathered the notebook and folded note, and he said he would deliver them to the local station as soon as possible. Marin said she would provide her statement about seeing the notebook drop 2 days earlier. Arvin agreed to guide officers to the pit if needed. They walked back toward the parking area while discussing safer trail access. Braden looked over his shoulder at the bench, and he felt a strange pull. The bench had been a quiet place for years, yet its role in 5 disappearances seemed tied to simple mistakes, hidden hazards, and poorly understood signals left by an unknown person. The truth felt less like a supernatural mystery and more like a chain of overlooked warnings. Braden left the park with a steady resolve to push for a full inspection. He believed the answers were already there in the bench, in the flowers, and in the fragments of notes hidden under old boards. The truth only needed patient eyes to connect what had been ignored, and he hoped the next visitor would find the trail safer once those connections reached the right people. The stories. Never take the shortcut behind the closed factory. The old shortcut behind the closed factory had a reputation that reportedly dated back to the early 2000s. Local reports described strange audio picked up by nearby delivery cameras during quiet nights when almost no one walked there. A worker named Lyron Strayed, who was 34 and handled maintenance jobs across small industrial sites, first heard those claims during a routine shift. He did not care much because his focus that day was finishing a late repair, then getting home before midnight. His route usually stayed along the main road, which felt safer and better lit. That changed when a dispatcher called near the end of his shift and asked for a quick check on a generator that kept tripping alarms. The generator sat near the old factory's fence line, which meant he had to park close to the edge of the blocked shortcut. He grabbed his tool bag and walked toward the unit while thinking about the shortcut stories he had ignored for years. The generator itself looked fine, though the alarm reset kept glitching in a way that suggested a loose internal relay. Lyron unscrewed the panel and ran a simple line test, which showed steady current without major issues. He decided the alarm might be reacting to stray interference from another unit placed years earlier near the empty factory. He stepped around the corner to inspect the older unit and noticed something unusual on the dirt path behind the fence. Fresh tire marks cut through the narrow corridor that was supposed to be locked and unused. He checked the fence and found the chain wrapped but not fully secured, like someone had looped it quickly without snapping the lock. Lyron returned to his truck for a small flashlight and snapped 2 photos of the fence for his report. He wanted to note it in case building management had missed scheduled security checks. When he stepped back toward the generator, his radio crackled with a faint distorted signal that did not match the dispatch channel he normally heard. He held the radio higher and listened as the interference grew stronger. A voice whispered a short phrase that sounded like an address fragment, though the last part cut out sharply. He checked his phone to compare signal strength, yet noticed a timestamp glitch on his call log that he had never seen before. He documented that odd timestamp with another photo, then continued to follow the tire tracks just far enough to understand their direction. They ran straight toward a collapsed loading ramp behind the factory that had not been accessed since a structural inspection during 1999. The ground around the ramp looked disturbed, like heavy weight had pressed into softened soil. He decided to notify dispatch from his truck, but his radio remained unstable even after he switched frequencies twice. A high-pitched tone hit suddenly, forcing him to hold the device farther from his ear. When the tone stopped, the radio returned to silence, and his screen lit with a brief recorded notification that did not belong to his model. Lyron scrolled through the message and found a short, archived clip that showed poor quality video from an unknown camera. The clip displayed the same loading ramp he had just examined. A figure moved across the screen, but disappeared mid-frame like the feed had dropped instantly. He drove closer to the edge of the shortcut and shut off his headlights to see the area better. The last street lamp flickered, producing uneven light over the ramp and fence. He kept his phone ready for an emergency call. He also reviewed his earlier photos because he wanted a clearer sense of the path shape before stepping near it again. Details he overlooked became clearer with a second look. The tire tracks overlapped an older set of boot prints that moved in the opposite direction toward the outer road. Those prints looked narrow and deep, like someone had walked quickly while carrying a heavy load. He checked the soil near his boots and found similar compression marks that matched the archived clip patterns almost exactly. He took more pictures and followed the tracks until he reached a corroded service door near the ramp. The door sat slightly open, though crews had sealed it with metal brackets during 2006. He pushed gently and felt resistance from warped hinges rather than any locking mechanism. Inside, the air smelled stale, and dust covered most surfaces. His light caught the outline of a forklift abandoned long ago, though the tire dust pattern suggested recent movement that did not match the machine's dead battery state. He lifted the engine cover briefly and saw untouched corrosion that proved the forklift had not operated recently, which made the tracks outside even stranger. Near the back wall, he found a stack of handwritten notes taped to a cabinet. The pages carried dates from the late 2000s and documented repeated complaints about unauthorized after-hours activity. One note mentioned an unidentified van entering through the same corridor that created the tire marks he saw. Another described auditory anomalies inside the building, captured by a security mic later removed during an equipment reduction. He copied the notes by taking photos and moved to the other end of the room where a damaged camera hung loose. The camera's data card remained inside, though the casing had cracked. He removed the card carefully and placed it inside an evidence pouch he kept for documenting property damage. The pouch kept dust-off sensitive parts, which might help tech staff recover something useful. When he stepped outside again, he noticed the street lamp flickering faster. A shadow crossed the ramp area, though no one appeared nearby. He raised his flashlight and scanned slowly until the beam caught a piece of torn reflective tape stuck to the fence. The tape matched a style used by highway crews in the early 2000s and had similar aging patterns to tape visible in the archived clip. He returned to his truck to call dispatch again and finally reached a stable connection. The dispatcher listened, then pulled up two old maintenance logs that referenced unusual trespassing during night shifts between 2003 and 2008. Those logs mentioned a possible smuggling route using the service door before the factory closed. The route was believed sealed after the inspection in 2006, but no follow-up confirmation existed. Lyron asked the dispatcher to check one more detail, specifically whether any recent patrol cars had reported activity near the shortcut. She checked and found a brief report from earlier that evening. A driver claimed he saw a van enter the far side of the blocked road, though no vehicle appeared on traffic cams afterward. He finished his call and walked back toward the generator to close his initial work order. The radio interference returned, but softer, almost like the earlier voice had weakened. He waited to see if anything else came through. Only a faint click repeated twice, matching the distortion pattern from the archived clip. Before leaving, he photographed the loading ramp again, along with the surrounding soil. When he reviewed the new images, he saw a fresh indentation near the forklift room entrance, as if someone or something had stepped there after he exited. The shape looked too narrow for a normal boot, but aligned perfectly with the print glimpse seen in the archived clip. He left the site carefully and locked the outer gate before sending all photos and the data card to the tech department. He then wrote a detailed report describing each anomaly exactly as he observed it. His findings matched older complaints closely, creating a pattern that suggested someone had been using the closed corridor long after the factory shut down. The next morning, the tech team confirmed the data card contained partial footage from 2 nights earlier that showed the same shadow crossing the loading ramp. They also discovered faint audio that matched the strange voice Lyron heard through his radio. It repeated the same clipped address fragment that had confused him near the generator. Investigators later checked that fragment and found it corresponded to an unregistered storage lot once connected to the factory by a freight contract during the late 1990s. The lot had changed ownership several times without clear documentation, which explained why no record connected it to the shortcut corridor anymore. Lyron stayed involved through follow-up calls for several weeks. His report became part of a larger inquiry into abandoned freight routes that still carried untracked activity. The case remained unofficial because none of the evidence pointed to a clear suspect or purpose. It only showed movement that had restarted for unknown reasons. He sometimes drove past the site after work and noticed the city had installed better locks and stronger lights. The shortcut no longer flickered with the eerie randomness that greeted him that night. He never again heard the distorted voice or saw odd timestamps on his radio displays. The experience left him cautious about places that looked abandoned but still carried signs of movement. He understood how easily someone could miss tiny clues unless the light hit them at the right angle. Every tire, track, shadow, and flicker had pointed to something real that operated quietly in the gaps between forgotten structures. He still thinks about the warning he heard from older workers who told him to avoid that corridor. Their stories felt exaggerated back then, yet the evidence he gathered proved there was always something strange behind the closed factory. The stories. What a night janitor found behind the vending machine. Roughly 10 years ago, a late shift incident at a small distribution center led to a report that never reached public records. The file described something a night janitor found behind a vending machine after a quiet shift turned strange. Rylan Cho worked nights at a regional packing warehouse on the edge of a mid-sized town. He was 37 and had been there almost 7 years. He liked the silence after midnight and usually finished his route with music in his earbuds. On this particular night, in late spring of 2014, he wanted to clock out early and get home before a storm hit the valley. He started in the loading bay with a simple goal for the night: finish his checklist, empty the bins, and mop the narrow hallway near the break room before the wind picked up outside. The building felt colder than usual, and the air system made a steady hum that covered most small sounds. The incident began around 1:30 in the morning when Rylan passed the break room and saw the vending machine screen flick on by itself. The machine had been glitchy before, so he did not think much of it until he noticed the light did not show the usual bright menu. Instead, it looked dim with a strange gray shimmer moving across the glass. A soft tapping sound came from behind the machine. Rylan stepped closer and asked out loud if someone was stuck. He expected no reply. The tapping repeated 2 times with steady rhythm. He backed up a little and checked the doorway leading to the maintenance hall. No one else should have been there since the last forklift crew left hours earlier. He went to find the shift supervisor but realized he was alone for the next hour since the supervisor had gone to the far lot to handle a truck issue. Rylan returned to the break room and watched the machine again. The shimmer on the screen grew lighter, then faded. He unplugged the power cord to reset it, and the tapping stopped. When he pushed the machine slightly, he felt something resist from behind. The machine sat tight against the wall with no gap. He moved it a few inches and saw a narrow, dark space behind the right side panel. Something metallic glinted inside the space. Rylan grabbed his small work light from the janitor cart and angled the beam toward the opening. A metal box covered with dust sat wedged between the drywall and the machine frame. The box looked old. The lid had a faded sticker with part of a name scratched off. He reached in and pulled it free. Inside were 3 items: a small bound notebook, a thin plastic badge with a photo rubbed almost blank, and an audio recorder the size of a deck of cards. The notebook smelled musty. The first page held uneven handwriting, saying property of Hale Dorn, who worked maintenance from 2003 to 2008 based on a short training archive. Rylan remembered hearing from older staff that Hale left suddenly after a safety investigation. Nothing official remained in the shared files. Most said he moved away. A few said he had filed complaints about strange vibrations near the break room wall. Rylan opened the notebook carefully. The first entry from early 2006 described recurring knocking sounds near the vending machine as well as faint static pulses in the wall during night shifts. Hale wrote that he made several unofficial recordings, but none stayed consistent when reviewed later. The next entries grew more detailed. Hale noted timestamps, short sketches of sound waves, and small maps of the hallway layout. One entry from late 2006 described a night when the machine screen flickered with a gray wash, similar to what Rylan had seen hours earlier. Hale wrote that the tapping seemed to follow his movements around the room. Rylan turned to the last written page, dated mid-2007. It read, "I need to get someone to check the wiring before this gets worse." The lines after that looked rushed. Hale wrote that he found a small access hole behind the machine with a narrow duct running into the maintenance room. He believed air pressure changes inside the duct caused some of the sounds. The next note stated, "I still hear something moving in there, although the duct should be empty." Rylan set the notebook down and inspected the audio recorder. It contained a small tape with a handwritten label that read Night Shift Sample 2. He slipped it into his pocket with the plan to listen later under better light. He then checked the badge. The image showed Hale with short hair and tired eyes. The back listed his role as maintenance support. Rylan pushed the machine farther from the wall to look for the duct mentioned in the notes. A narrow, circular opening near the baseboard revealed an old service channel that ran behind several rooms. It had not been used in years based on the dust and cobwebs. The channel connected to the maintenance room and likely carried air back when the building used a different system. He crouched closer and felt a cool draft from deep inside the channel. The draft moved in a steady pulse instead of a constant stream. When he leaned nearer, he heard a faint scrape followed by two soft taps. He jumped back and called out if anyone was inside. No reply followed. Rylan stood still and waited for another sound. 3 minutes passed quietly. He reached into the opening with the work light and shined the beam across the first few feet. Dust floated in the narrow space and nothing moved. The scrape sound did not repeat. He repositioned the vending machine and photographed the channel opening so he could show the supervisor. He then finished his route feeling uneasy. When his shift ended at 3, he took the notebook and recorder home. Later that afternoon, he listened to the tape. It began with low background hum, likely from the old air system. 30 seconds in, a rhythmic tapping started. It matched the pattern Rylan heard earlier. The tapping repeated 4 times, then stopped. Hale's voice spoke quietly, saying, "I know the duct is empty, yet it keeps making that pattern." The tape ended with a short, static burst. Rylan cross-checked the tape with archived maintenance logs from 2006 available through an internal server. He found a note about air pressure complaints near the break room, but no follow-up reports. The log mentioned Hale's concern about a possible leak inside the service channel and recommended an inspection that never occurred. Rylan met with the supervisor the next night and showed the findings. The supervisor listened to part of the tape and agreed that the sound pattern matched what past crews mentioned during older shifts. He filed a report to the facilities manager, who arranged a full inspection later that week. The inspection team removed the vending machine and opened the service channel. They found a partially detached metal flap deep inside that moved when the air system cycled. The flap created repeated taps during pressure changes, which explained the pattern recorded by Hale. Inspectors also found old tools left behind by a previous contractor, which caused the scrape Rylan heard. The team sealed the channel, repaired the flap, and recommended replacing the vending machine wiring due to aging components that caused the strange screen flicker reported by both Hale and Rylan. 2 weeks later, the warehouse returned to normal. The tapping never came back. The recording was archived inside a general maintenance file, and the notebook was stored with other historical documents kept for internal reference. Rylan kept thinking about how one small discovery behind a vending machine connected him to someone who tried to document the same odd sounds years earlier. He believed Hale had tried to solve a problem that no one else seemed to notice until the notes surfaced again. The story lives quietly inside a handful of reports, and one old tape that proves how simple, overlooked issues can create experiences that feel much stranger than they are, especially during long nights when empty hallways amplify every sound. Corin prepared to leave, and he secured the logbook under his arm because he planned to hand it over to the harbor office. As he reached the ground floor, he heard a deep thud from above, like something heavy striking the metal railing. He looked up the stairwell and saw dust drifting through the pale air, and he called out in a steady voice, asking if anyone needed help. No reply came, and he hurried outside because the building felt wrong. The fog had thickened into a wall that blocked the path back to town, and he saw a faint glow near the rocks, as though the skiff lights flickered through the mist. He considered walking toward the beach, and he radioed the harbor office with a brief report of strange activity near the tower. Dispatch logs indicate that Corin's transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the signal ended with a burst of static. A search team followed the path an hour later, and they found his tool pack near the lighthouse door, but not his radio or the logbook. Witness statements described drifting voices on the water that night, and one crew member claimed he saw a dim lantern moving inside the tower. The unsigned log discovered months later matched the fragments found in Corin's notes, and investigators believed the entries were written over several days. They concluded that the skiff likely struck a submerged ledge, and they suspected Corin attempted to reach survivors through the dense fog. No further entries appeared after the final line mentioning the figure on the gallery. The lighthouse remains closed today, and the tower stands quiet during most storms. Local crews say the watchroom light sometimes flickers during heavy fog, and they assume it is faulty wiring from years of neglect. The final log stays in a small archive, where the pages still show faint stains from salt air and old sea fog, and the case sits unsolved with quiet respect for the missing caretaker. The stories. Never open the locker marked staff only at this pool. It was reported that an old community pool kept one locker sealed during every shift, which matched the warning painted on its door. Local staff claimed the warning came from an incident in the early 2010s that never made public records. On a warm morning in late July 2019, a 28-year-old lifeguard named Rylan Keene started his first full weekend shift. He worked part-time at the pool while finishing a safety certification course, and he had a simple plan that day. He wanted to close early, finish his paperwork, and head home before the evening rush. The pool sat near a quiet suburb, and most regular visitors arrived with kids who stayed close to the shallow end. Rylan checked the schedule board, then walked along the lockers behind the staff counter while sipping a cheap canned coffee. He noticed a metal locker that looked older than the rest, and its front carried the words "Staff Only" in faded red paint. The manager had already mentioned the locker during training, stating that nobody should open it since the last documented key went missing years earlier. Reports from retired employees suggested the door once belonged to the maintenance area, although the structure behind it had been remodeled in 2008. Rylan always thought the story was exaggerated to keep kids from sneaking inside. That morning, he heard a dull rattle from the locker, which felt unusual since no one stored equipment there. He tapped the metal surface with two knuckles and heard something shift inside. He looked around the empty hallway and said quietly, "Anyone stuck in there?" which made no sense because the locker was too narrow for a person. The sound stopped, then a faint thud followed, which tightened the idea that maybe an animal had crawled in through the back. Rylan fetched a flashlight from the front desk and returned to inspect the vent near the locker base. Dust coated the grate, and nothing suggested active airflow. He crouched lower but noticed a small slip of paper on the floor, folded twice with the edges stiff from moisture. It looked recently placed and carried a quick note reading, "Check logs before closing time." The handwriting looked rushed, and he recognized none of the staff who wrote like that. He placed the note in his pocket and opened the office drawer where old incident binders were kept. The logs from 2011 through 2014 were thin, while the binder labeled 2015 through 2017 held several handwritten entries from night shifts. One entry from late August 2015 described a report of heavy knocking from behind the old locker. The guard wrote that he radioed a supervisor, then waited 15 minutes before the noise stopped. Another entry from early June 2017 mentioned a staffer who claimed to hear a voice calling for help from inside the wall. The supervisor at the time marked both events as unverified due to limited evidence. Rylan read further and found an archived maintenance note claiming the original access hallway behind the locker had been closed after a small structural collapse in 2010. Workers sealed the area with sheet metal and advised future crews to avoid disturbing it. The description matched the dimensions of the locker, so it seemed the locker mostly existed to cover the patch. Before he could finish the binder, a regular swimmer named Tala Pembry approached the desk to ask about the lap lane schedule. She was in her 40s and visited nearly every morning. She noticed the binder and said, "You checking the old disturbance files," which caught him by surprise because he had not mentioned anything. She explained that she swam here in 2010 when the collapse happened. She remembered a construction light falling behind the wall and a worker yelling that someone was still inside the hallway. Tala claimed she never heard what happened afterward, and she said the staff acted nervous for weeks. Rylan asked what she remembered about the worker. She paused, then said, "He was young, maybe early 20s, before walking toward the changing rooms." Her voice shook slightly, as if she had debated sharing more. He returned to the hallway with the locker and listened again. There was no sound now, only the faint buzz of old fluorescent bulbs. He reached for the handle and felt a cold vibration that did not match the ambient temperature. He stepped back and considered calling the manager, but he knew the manager would say it was nothing more than old pipes. Rylan spent the next hour monitoring the pool and checking the locker during each sweep. At 2 in the afternoon, the note in his pocket felt heavier somehow. He unfolded it again and noticed that the ink looked smeared, almost as if the message had been written minutes earlier rather than hours ago. He checked the front desk computer for any digital archive of maintenance calls near that structure. The system showed a report from 2019, only 4 months old, where a staff member logged hearing metal scraping behind the locker. The entry stated that the scraping stopped when they stepped closer. Later that afternoon, an older groundskeeper named Ward Leston entered the office to collect spare filters. Ward had worked there for more than 15 years and kept a quiet personality. Ryland decided to ask him directly about the locker. Ward froze for a second, then said, "Leave that alone. Someone got hurt behind that door long ago, and the place never settled right." He refused to explain further and left with the filters without another word. With every hour passing, the hallway felt heavier, as if the air thickened around the locker. Around 5:30, the pool emptied, and a soft tapping came from the metal door. Ryland tightened his grip on the flashlight and said, "If there is an animal inside, I have to check before closing." The tapping shifted into a sliding sound, as if something moved downward. He leaned close and whispered, "Do you need help?" which felt ridiculous, but came out naturally. To his shock, a weak voice answered through the thin panel. It sounded like a scared young man saying, "I am stuck in the hall," followed by a strained cough. Ryland jumped back, then approached again and said, "I will get help. Stay calm." He ran toward the maintenance shed and grabbed a crowbar, then returned with his pulse racing. He wedged the tool under the corner and pried, expecting the metal to bend easily. Instead, the locker door lifted sharply on its own, almost like someone had tugged it from the inside. A sharp burst of cold air hit his face as the door cracked open by less than an inch. He pointed the flashlight through the gap and saw a narrow cavity behind the metal panel. It looked like an old service corridor lined with dusty concrete. At the far end, he spotted a reflective surface that resembled a safety vest, and the faint voice called again, saying, "Please pull me out." The corridor seemed impossibly deep compared to the thickness of the wall, which caused him to recoil in confusion. Seconds later, his radio crackled by itself with heavy static that drowned all pool noise. The corridor darkened as if an unseen shadow moved closer, and the vest shape disappeared completely. The voice stopped mid-sentence, and the temperature dropped sharply, making his arms shake. He stepped backward, and the locker door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the empty hallway. He tried the handle again, but it would not budge, and the flashlight died without warning. He backed away and held his breath as the building settled. No further sounds came from the locker. Dispatch logs later stated that he reported the incident at 6:10 in the evening, though the call lasted only 9 seconds before the line failed. Management inspected the locker the next morning, but found no evidence of a corridor or any exposed space. They claimed the interior showed only plywood backing and sealed insulation. Ryland insisted on what he saw, but the staff reminded him that the structure behind the locker had been permanently filled. He wrote a full report, which was stored with older, unexplained events. Weeks later, a former construction worker visited the pool to repair a broken gate. When Ryland described the voice, the worker asked if it sounded like a man named Astor Holt, who went missing during the 2010 collapse. Records suggested he entered the service hall before the accident, though recovery teams never found him. The worker whispered that some crews believed the hall never sealed completely, and the pool carried echoes from that gap. Ryland eventually left the job, but he kept the original folded note as uneasy proof of that day. The locker remains bolted shut, and new staff are told the same warning he once ignored. Some visitors claim they still hear tapping near closing time, though it stops the moment anyone acknowledges it. For anyone walking those quiet hallways, the warning on the locker remains clear. Never open the locker marked staff only at this pool. The stories. The archivist who decoded a warning inside a missing person file. In a small county records office tied to a quiet mountain town, a file about a long missing hiker raised concern. It arrived without explanation in a plain envelope with an outdated seal that looked wrong to the staff. Calder Rusk was 39 and worked as an archivist who handled old case materials with careful routine. He liked quiet tasks during long shifts and kept notes about unusual items that passed through his desk. He lived outside town and drove an old sedan that handled mountain roads well. His plan that day in early autumn was simple. He wanted to finish indexing property disputes from 2008 and leave before sunset. The envelope changed that plan with a sharp interruption. Its paper felt older than the date stamp, which claimed 2015. The handwriting on the label looked rushed and uneven, which bothered him in a way he could not explain. Inside the envelope sat a missing person report about a hiker named Ryan Halper, who vanished during late summer 2015. The file included faded prints that showed a trail near a power station that had closed years earlier, according to county logs. A short field note from an unnamed deputy was clipped inside the report, and that detail confused Calder. The deputy note carried a single line that read, "A warning was heard near the ridge before we lost contact." There was no signature and no follow-up page, which conflicted with what Calder had learned about normal procedure. He checked the index card drawer for the deputy roster from that year. He found a roster with a missing entry number that hinted at an unfiled edition. Calder decided to verify the report by checking archive dispatch summaries kept in a separate compact shelf. He pulled a binder marked Summer Cases 2015 and scanned each page with slow care. One entry mentioned a static-filled call from an officer near the old ridge trail where the hiker vanished. It noted that the call ended after a loud crack reported by dispatch staff. He compared the time of that call with a note in the missing person report and noticed a mismatch that felt important. The report claimed the call never connected, yet the dispatch summary claimed it lasted several minutes. He wrote both details in his notebook because he wanted a clear timeline. He planned to confirm the timestamps using recorded reel backups stored in a temperature-controlled locker below the office. The reel system was old but reliable and required a special key that he kept on a wrist chain for emergency work. He unlocked the cabinet and threaded the reel for the afternoon of the hiker disappearance. The recording started with normal chatter about trail conditions that matched weather logs filed that week. It shifted after a faint voice cut through the static, repeating a short phrase. The phrase sounded like "stay above the red markers," which made Calder pause because the trail maps from that year used blue markers. He replayed that section several times and heard a second voice say the markers were changed without notice earlier that month. He checked a laminated map from 2015 stored in a drawer down the hall. The map showed blue markers along the ridge, despite the comment on the reel. Calder wondered if someone updated the trail signs unofficially, which could confuse hikers unfamiliar with the area. He called a retired ranger named Ballen, who sometimes answered questions about old trail conditions. Ballen told him that a volunteer crew repainted the ridge trail during late summer 2015 due to erosion damage. He added that the crew reported a missing paint supply that delayed work during the final week. This detail matched a line in the missing person report that mentioned a misplaced equipment crate near the ridge boundary. Calder believed the misplaced crate might explain the repainted markers if someone used the wrong color during rushed repairs. He added that thought to his notes and checked weather data again. He found that a storm hit the ridge that same evening, which might have washed away parts of the trail. He returned to the file and noticed a small fold at the corner of a photo that revealed another handwritten line. The line said the warning was not meant for us, which made him uneasy because it echoed the earlier note from the deputy. He held the photo under a desk lamp and saw faint indentations behind the words. The indentations looked like someone wrote a longer message on a removed page. Calder used a soft graphite stick to shade the back of the photo gently, which revealed fragments of a sentence. The fragments read "Trail shift noted after rails collapsed," which pointed to structural issues near the Ridge Power Station. He checked maintenance logs kept before the station closed in 2011. The logs confirmed repeated warnings about unstable railings near the ridge overlook. He suspected the missing hiker might have walked near that overlook after the storm started, which could explain the disappearance. He searched the envelope again and found a small memory card taped under the inner flap. The card held a short audio clip recorded by someone walking uphill during strong wind. The clip ended with the same phrase heard in the reel, "Stay above the red markers," spoken by a strained voice. Calder compared the wind noise from the clip with weather station data and concluded it matched the storm peak that evening. He realized the warning might have been directed at the volunteer crew who repainted the trail and not at search teams. The crew may have marked a detour with red signs that never made it onto the official map. That possibility explained the conflicting colors noted in the reel. He formed a theory that the hiker followed the new red markers, which led toward the unstable overlook rather than the safe path. The missing crate and rushed repairs might have contributed to poor placement of those temporary signs. Calder wrote a summary that connected the deputy note, the audio clip, and the map inconsistencies. He delivered the summary to his supervisor, who agreed to send it to county search coordinators for review. In the following days, a review team hiked the ridge and found remnants of weathered red paint on a fallen post near the overlook. They also found metal fragments that matched railings documented in the 2011 maintenance logs. These findings supported Calder's belief that the hiker followed an unofficial detour that collapsed during the storm. Calder knew the case remained unresolved, yet he felt the evidence finally clarified the warning inside the file. The message pointed to a rushed trail change that confused both hikers and responders back in 2015. As he closed the binder, he realized some files waited years for someone to read them in the right order. He locked the envelope in a secure drawer and left the office with a quiet sense of closure. The stories. The final log from a lighthouse on a foggy coast. A faded coastal report from 2008 mentions an unsigned log found inside a shuttered lighthouse during routine maintenance. Workers said it looked recent, even though the building had been locked for years. The discovery triggered a quiet review that centered on one man named Corin Halbrook, who once served as the tower caretaker. Corin was 39 and worked as a part-time dockhand in a nearby fishing town, and he checked the old structure whenever storms rolled through. He liked the quiet building, and he felt responsible for keeping it safe because his late father had worked there decades earlier. On a cold morning in early autumn, he headed out with a simple goal, which was to finish a roof inspection before the fog returned. He hiked the narrow path with his tool pack, and he noticed the fog drifting in faster than expected. A supply boat sounded its horn, and the echo pulled his attention to shifting shapes that moved across the water. He reached the lighthouse door and found fresh scrape marks on the metal surface, and that detail threw off his routine. Inside, he heard a soft clatter from the watchroom above, and he paused because no one should have been there. He climbed the steep stairs, and the air felt heavier with each step because the tower trapped the fog that seeped through old seams. When he reached the top landing, he noticed a lantern lit on the small desk, and he knew he had not left it there earlier that week. He read the open logbook and saw an entry written in a neat hand that did not match his script. The note described a boat drifting without lights near the shoals, and the timestamp matched the previous night. Corin wondered who had written it, and he checked the radio shelf and found a handheld set powered on with low battery. He stepped outside to scan the water, and the fog swallowed most of the horizon except for a dim shape moving slowly near the rocks. He raised his binoculars and saw what looked like an old skiff listing toward a channel notorious for hidden ledges. He called a warning through the radio, and he waited for a response that never came. When he hurried back inside, he noticed another fresh line in the logbook, and it read that the skiff had no operator visible on deck. The handwriting appeared slightly rushed, and Corin felt a jolt because the ink looked wet. He checked the stairs and heard faint steps descending even though no one passed him on the landing. He followed the sound to the service room, and he found a damp jacket draped over a chair that had been dry earlier that week. The pockets held a small notebook with water stains, and the pages carried brief notes about frequent, low fog and strange lights near the channel. The most recent note mentioned a voice over the water calling for help, and Corin closed the book because the air suddenly felt colder. He decided to document the building for safety, and he used his small camera to take photos of the fresh marks on the door and the lit lantern. He moved room to room, and he captured the damp jacket along with the notebook because he wanted evidence for the harbor office. When he checked the time, he noticed the fog outside turning a darker shade, and that sign suggested another weather shift. He stepped out on the gallery to examine the water, and he heard a low groan coming from the direction of the shoals. He could not see the skiff anymore, and the silence that followed pressed against his nerves. He returned to the watchroom and prepared to close the logbook, and that was when he noticed a final half-written entry near the bottom of the page. The unfinished line described a man on the gallery waving toward the tower, and Corin froze because he realized he had just been on that same walkway. He checked the door and found it closed tight, and he felt sure no one had entered while he moved through the rooms. He read the last words again, and the implication unsettled him more than any storm he had faced. Corin prepared to leave, and he secured the logbook under his arm because he planned to hand it over to the harbor office. As he reached the ground floor, he heard a deep thud from above, like something heavy striking the metal railing. He looked up the stairwell and saw dust drifting through the pale air, and he called out in a steady voice asking if anyone needed help. No reply came, and he hurried outside because the building felt wrong. The fog had thickened into a wall that blocked the path back to town, and he saw a faint glow near the rocks, as though the skiff lights flickered through the mist. He considered walking toward the beach, and he radioed the harbor office with a brief report of strange activity near the tower. Dispatch logs indicate that Corin's transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the signal ended with a burst of static. A search team followed the path an hour later, and they found his tool pack near the lighthouse door, but not his radio or the logbook. Witness statements described drifting voices on the water that night, and one crew member claimed he saw a dim lantern moving inside the tower. The unsigned log discovered months later matched the fragments found in Corin's notes, and investigators believe the entries were written over several days. They concluded that the skiff likely struck a submerged ledge, and they suspected Corin attempted to reach survivors through the dense fog. No further entries appeared after the final line mentioning the figure on the gallery. The lighthouse remains closed today, and the tower stands quiet during most storms. Local crews say the watchroom light sometimes flickers during heavy fog, and they assume it is faulty wiring from years of neglect. The final log stays in a small archive, where the pages still show faint stains from salt air and old sea fog, and the case sits unsolved with quiet respect for the missing caretaker.